Radio TV phono nut here, and what we have is the chassis out of an Admiral wooden cased radio from the early 40s. This is just a typical 6-tube series string chassis that covers the standard broadcast band and the old police band from roughly 1.7 to 3.5 megacycles, something like that. No, this radio has not been recapped. I've done no kind of service on it at all, and here's the problem. It plays, but it's not quite as robust as it could be.
Sometimes we do, but we almost never hire relatives, and
that's on a local station turned all the way up. Now, it's not nearly as bad as it could be, but it could be a whole lot better. Now, when a radio is just not as perky as it should be, sometimes those kind of sets can be difficult to troubleshoot because the problem can be in any stage of the receiver, and it can be in a combination of stages. And when one's as old as this one is and hasn't been serviced, more than likely it's going to be a combination of stages that's causing the problem. Now, couple of things you can check is see how good the reception is.
You know, that's tough. We have hired,
Yeah, it's about 7 o'clock at night.
Free online shopping tool that automatically finds the
There's a distance station. There's a distance station.
Put this together for the long haul.
I'm hearing some distant stations there, just not a lot of volume. Now, that would tell me that the front end, it may not be as perky as it should be, but it's doing well enough to bring in some distant stations. So that tells me that we need to start in the audio circuit and then work our way back. Here's the underside of the radio chassis, mostly untouched. I see that this filter capacitor has been replaced, and it has a date code of 6130 on it, so this radio was in use at least up until 1961, and this capacitor was replaced, which is the plate to grid coupling cap for the audio output tube, probably done at the same time that this capacitor was replaced. Now, all I've done was cut out the across the AC line capacitor because it looked kind of bad, and I didn't want it blowing its end out and possibly blowing out the 35Z5, so I just went ahead and clipped it out of the circuit. Now let's check some voltages in our audio output and first audio stage and see what we can come up with. Alright, here's the audio output tube. I'm interested in my cathode voltage, our control grid voltage, plate voltage, and screen grid voltage. So let's start with the cathode and see what we have. And by the way, this is a hot chassis set, so we're using the chassis as circuit ground, so we have our negative lead of our meter connected there, and of course the radio is plugged into an isolation transformer. Alright, pin 8. And we have 8 volts on the cathode. That seems pretty healthy. Alright, pin 5. Nothing there, that's good. Okay, pin 4, that is the screen grid. 111 volts. In pin 3, the plate voltage. 103 volts. That's not throwing up huge red flags to me. Alright, now let's go back to the first audio tube and check our plate voltage. 17 volts on the plate of the first audio tube. That's kind of low. Now that's probably due to either this plate load resistor having gone up in value, or possibly the B plus is not quite as high going into the resistor, or there could be something on the plate side of that resistor, loading it down, or it could be a combination of all three things. Like I said, when you get a radio this old, it's probably going to have numerous problems, especially if it hasn't been serviced. And as you can see, this one hasn't been serviced in quite some time. Alright, this resistor is supposed to be 150K, body, brown, end, green, which is 5, and brown is 1, by the way, and then yellow. So that indicates 150K ohms with a silver band. That's 10%. So as long as the measured value is within plus or minus 10% of the resistor's stated value, then we'll be in good shape. And it's reading 192,000 ohms, so that resistor is well out of tolerance, and we need to replace it. Hopefully I have some 150K ohm resistors handy or something close to it. It's not super critical, but don't want to get too far out. Alright, that brought it up a meager 2 volts. Now, however, when I turn the volume control up, it goes up to about 30 volts. Alright, this plate bypass capacitor had broken off here at the end, so we're going to go ahead and change that, which is a good idea anyway. And our cathode resistor is supposed to be 150 ohms, or at least that's what it looks like. That's generally the standard value. But it measures 247 ohms, so it needs to go. So we'll just go ahead and get rid of both of those parts while we're here, and that should take care of the audio output stage. Alright, after replacing those parts with the correct values, our plate voltage actually dropped down a little bit.
7 FM, W259 BP Meridian, and 1450 AM, W.
97 volts now. So yeah, what's happening most likely is with the correct value parts, that tube is turned on a bit harder and conducting more and loading the B plus down. And I would think it should be higher than that. So, that means something else in the circuit is either loading the set down, or we have a weak rectifier tube, or something like that. So let's try to find out the cause. Well, I pulled the 35Z5 out to check it, which as you can see by the burn off here on the top, this tube has had a lot of hours stuck at the tube tester. It won't light. So I checked the filament continuity, and the tap is open between 2 and 3, and nothing seems to be shorted in the radio, or at least nothing went out in a blaze of glory before I turned it off. So, and that could cause the filament to open. So I'm thinking this just picked this moment to decide it was through working for us. Okay, so our Sprague atom passes the ESR test, but our microfarad value reads high. Now, could that be that this cap is just an overachiever, or is it leaky and fooling the meter into thinking that it's a bigger cap than it actually is? Well, let's put it on the leakage tester and find out. Alright, we're connected. I'm set to the electrolytic position. I'm really not worried about the value. Now let's set it to the 50 volt scale. Light comes on for a few seconds, goes off. That's what we want to see. Now we'll move up to the 200 volt scale, which is really too high, but these older capacitors can usually take it. And even at the 200 volt scale, let's flip this back down to discharge it. Even at the 200 volt scale, the light comes on for a second and goes off. Section 2, the 50 volt scale. Beautiful. Beautiful. Now here's an older capacitor that I know is leaky, so let's connect it to the tester and see how it checks. Alright, capacitor is connected. Notice on 50 volts the light is just staying on and not going off. That means we have a leaky capacitor. Now, if I left this on long enough, the capacitor might reform and work fine. And I've known a lot of known of guys who use these old school capacitor testers for that very purpose, reforming old electrolytic caps, but quite frankly, I'm not going to take that risk. Caps are cheap enough, and if one's bad, it's going to get replaced. And obviously, if it's leaking on the 50-volt range, it's going to leak even worse on the 200-volt range. So let's turn this back down and discharge it, and we'll test the other section, which I have not previously tested yet. All right, section 2. Yeah, it's also leaky, and more so at 200 volts. Now this is not an ESR test. This would actually be more like a parallel resistance test, the equivalent of a capacitor with a resistor in parallel with it. ESR test, you can think of that as a resistor in series with the capacitor. This leaky cap with a big blob on it connected to the modern day digital capacitance meter, which by the way, this is a dual 20 microfarad. Section 1 reads 26.4 and section 2 reads 30 microfarad. Well, you might test it on something like this and say, well, that capacitor is good to go. I can use it. Well, not necessarily, because this old school tester up here actually applies high voltage and tests for leakage, which as you saw was present. On the ESR tester, it's reading pretty darn good. About as almost as perfect as you can get. Let's test the other section. And section 2 is reading pretty good as well. So yeah, there are actually several tests for a capacitor. You just can't rely on a modern day capacitance meter clipped across it to give you an accurate representation. Now you might ask yourself, why was this supposed non-leaky capacitor reading a good bit higher on the capacitance meter? Well, back then the tolerance ranges of these older electrolytic capacitors could be anywhere from -10 or -20% to as much as 80 to 100% higher than the stated value. That's just the way they were made. So when you measure one of these on a new capacitance meter and it reads high, you want to ask yourself, is it really an overachiever, or is it really leaky and fooling my capacitance meter? And that's why you need some form of leakage tester, such as one of these old school jobs here, or there's a tester that Mr. Carlson's lab has invented that will test these for leakage at low voltage. I have not looked into building one of those yet. That might be a project I consider down the road, but I'll say his tester would be a good alternative for a couple of reasons. Number one, these types of testers are getting stupidly high in price, and you can blame that on the reforming crowd that I mentioned earlier. And the second advantage that his tester has over this type of tester is his tester is designed to use low voltage, whereas this tester puts out up to 600 volts. And if you're not careful, you can get a pretty good zap from it. And not only can you get zapped by the voltage from the tester itself, if you fail to discharge the capacitor under test and disconnect the test leads from the tester, the capacitor could still hold a nasty charge that could give you a pretty good zap too. So if you find one of these old testers and overhaul it, just use proper safety precautions when using it. But as far as this capacitor, I'm perfectly okay with using it. It passes all the tests, and I just might very well put it back in the radio a little bit neater than whoever installed it the first time did, of course. Yeah, I could put a couple of new electrolytics in here. They're not that expensive, but I think I'll just put this one back in here just to make some of the cap changer crowd wet their pants, in addition to the pants wetting that's probably going to take place when you see the cabinet for this radio.
It's the Jason Smith Show with Mike Harvey, with a safe space on the radio.
Alright, I have everything corrected as far as the wiring cleaned up on the rectifier tube socket. It's still a little sloppy looking because one of the tube socket terminals, someone cut into the, well, let me back up. If you've looked at this old stuff, you know that a lot of tube socket terminals have two holes in it to facilitate the mounting of multiple wires or component leads or whatever, because believe me, there's just only so much you can put in one hole. And on the top rung of one of the tube socket terminals on the rectifier tube, they cut half of that off, so that made it a little bit more difficult to mount stuff, but we got it back in there, and the radio is playing. I replaced the across the line capacitor with a 0.1 microfarad. The original was a 0.047, but it's not that critical. I replaced the rectifier tube with a used one, and our plate voltage came up just a little bit. We're up to about 100 volts now.
Have come out of the woodwork like cockroaches. This is self-inflicted wounds. Now, this is happening at Disney. I feel like the perfect analogy would be a Walt Disney.
Now what I want to do is, just to be on the safe side, I want to monitor the control grid voltage of the output tube and make sure it doesn't go positive after the set warms up, because if it does, that indicates a gassy tube, and that could put a excessive load on the power supply. And I think another reason for the slightly lower B+ voltage is they're not taking the output transformer off of the directly off of the cathode of the rectifier tube. They're taking it off of the screen grid, which comes after the filter choke. So in that situation, the plate voltage is going to be a bit lower.
That's one.
Alright, right now we have a negative voltage with reference to chassis ground. So we'll just let that play a few minutes and see if that remains negative. The speaker is going to need a little help too. I can see that this AVC filter capacitor has been replaced at some point in time, because they just had this lead just laying on top of this lead where the other cap was clipped from, and a blob of solder on it. So while we have that loose, I will substitute another capacitor in its place and see if there's any difference between the two. And if there's not, I'll just go ahead and put this one back in circuit. Neater this time. Alright, here's a new cap substituted. Now this is what happens when I disconnect the old cap. You hear it start squealing and oscillating.
Oh yeah, today. This is the Doug Gottlieb Show on Fox.
Well, what this cap does is shunts any RF that might be on the AVC line to ground.
That's incorporated expertise.
And whenever you don't have that cap, RF is present on the AVC line, and that can cause squealing and oscillation. Well, that's all the same thing. And it can even cause the section to go away completely. Now I'm going to substitute the old cap back in and see if there's any difference made. Alright, come on over here.
And that's from Toyota, Corolla, Tacoma, Highlander, and Tundra. Pick out a Nissan.
Nope, I really can't tell any difference at all, so we're going to more neatly put that one back in circuit. Since I had to pull everything loose here anyway to clean up the other mess, I went ahead and checked these resistors on the AVC line, and they're both within tolerance. They're not so far out that it would keep the radio from working properly. And we substituted this capacitor with a new one, and no change noted. Now, is this capacitor likely leaky? Yes, but there's very little voltage on this particular capacitor, and which means the capacitor's leakage may not be a problem in this case. Now, if this was used in a circuit where there was 100, 150, 200 volts or more on one side of it, then it would probably be an issue. Okay, we have everything connected back more neatly, and technically I should have replaced this black wire going up into the IF transformer. It's starting to crumble, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Alright, the only other capacitors left is this thing here that's the cathode bypass for the RF amplifier tube, and this tone condenser that is in conjunction with this potentiometer here, which connects to the plate of the first audio tube. I don't think this cathode bypass capacitor is causing a problem, but like the AVC cap, I'll take it loose and substitute it for a new capacitor and see if any improvements noted. If it's not, then we'll put the old one back in circuit.
Dig a little bit deeper than that when you're talking about how can...
Alright, actually there's no difference whether the cap is in circuit, out of circuit, whether I use the old cap or new cap. And between the two caps, our cathode voltage is 5.7 volts, so I see no reason to change that cap. Now that cap not being there could cause some oscillation that we don't want, so we will keep a cap there, but I don't see any need in changing it right now. Okay, we have the tone cap disconnected. I'm monitoring the plate voltage of the first audio tube. Got 19 volts with it all the way down.
Jimmy, listen, safe travels to the bubble. Look forward to catching up with you, and maybe I'll let you take some money off me on the golf course very soon.
$2 brother.
And at max, it jumps up to about 70 volts. So let's put the cap back in circuit and see how much it hogs down the voltage. Alright, with cap.
Get high-quality smartphones at a great price.
Without cap.
This is your wake-up call. Learn more at TrackPhone.com today.
It didn't make any
TrackPhone Wireless. Now you're in control.
We are a force.
Tax-laying force. We march forward with a trusted family-owned company at our back.
Okay, I see no evidence that this cap is pulling the voltage down, so I think we can leave it in circuit too. Okay, we have the RF signal generator connected and set to 455 kilocycles, and if I turn the dial on the generator, I can tell the IF is out of alignment, because you can hear it gets louder. Alright, let's see. That one's pretty good. That one was off. That one was way off. And that one was way off. And we'll turn the generator down and go back through and re-peak them. Touching up the IF transformers and the trimmers on the tuning condenser helped a little, but not much. So I'm checking tubes. This second IF amplifier tube is not in the best of shape, as you can see. It bounces up to the weak area and then it falls back down into the bad. Grid emission is high. See if we got any shorts. No, but we need another 12SK7. And the 12SR7 has a short. Alright, swapping the tubes around didn't really help anything. In fact, putting a 12SQ7 in there made things a bit worse, because those are different tube types. One's a high mu and one's a medium mu. I don't know whether this originally had a 12SR7 or a 12SQ7, because I can't find a model number to get a schematic. So I'm probably just going to have to go look under Admiral and just do an extensive search and try to find something that looks like this. Alright, we're on the public service band, and I'm picking up 1700 out of Huntsville, Alabama, on the low end of that band. And we can tell that connecting an outside antenna does improve performance. Also doesn't help that we have thunderstorms in the area.
Lost weight. More important.
There's not going to be much on that low-end public service band anymore.
These common areas like the lobby where it matters.
Right now we're on AM, standard broadcast. And yes, the antenna is definitely working. Should have known what that was. Alright, the schematic I found on a similar radio, the one I found doesn't have push button tuning and only has the standard broadcast band. Otherwise it looks very similar. This grid resistor on the output tube, they're calling for 500 ohms, which is 500,000 ohms, which is generally the standard value. However, in here they have a 250K ohm that's reading about 330K. And I'm wondering if this is a replacement resistor, seeing how it's all stuck in here, this long lead in here like this. And the cathode resistor, they say 200 ohms on the schematic, and that's the one you may remember that was kind of faded, and I couldn't tell whether it was brown or red, so we may just have to up that to 200 ohms and change this over to a 500K or something there close and see if that'll improve our audio somewhat, because it seems like with a decent antenna the reception's pretty good despite the fact of all the thunderstorm activity in the air. Here's the resistor that came out of it. And after spraying it with some cleaner, it's starting to look more reddish to me now, so that could very well be a 200 ohm resistor, 200 ohm 10%, so 180 to 220 ohms should be sufficient. Okay, playing with the value of that grid resistor didn't really do anything, so I just left the original in there. But I did notice this, sticking out the front, we have this folded up, wadded up paper between the tuning condenser and the chassis. And I think I see what they did. The grommets, the mounting grommets, have long ago crumbled and fallen apart. And they ran this under there to elevate the tuning condenser so it would be sitting stable and wouldn't vibrate as much. Well, let's see what's on these folded up pieces of paper. Well, I would take it that this once said it's wonderful to be a hostess and profitable too. And on the back, $99 sales, choice of number 8017 Rival 2-speed, probably blender, or 2800 Stanley coupons, extra special, $49 sales, and 2 parties, blah, blah, blah. Really ain't nothing to that. Alright, let's see what's on this other piece of paper. I see written on here 12AV6, 12AV6, 35 or 50C5, And this looks like the diagram, the wiring diagram of a couplet, which was a component combination that was used in a lot of radios from the 50s up through the end of the tube era. Not in this set, however. So I suspect whoever rammed that paper under there was a radio repair shop. It wasn't just some set owner. This was some radio repair shop that didn't want to take the time to pull the tuning condenser and fix it right, so they just rammed this under there. Alright, there are the 3 mounting screws, and the grommets have all turned to powder except this little piece of one that's left. So we're going to dig through my small grommet assortment and see if I can find something to replace these 3 with. Well, as it turns out, there's 4 screws holding this tuning assembly in place. And I found 3 grommets that have small center holes in them. I'd have to enlarge them a little bit, maybe, that fit here just perfect, but couldn't find a 4th one, which that's about the way it always works. I found another one I can put in here, but I'm going to have to punch out the center so I can put my screw in. And it's not quite as tall as these, so might be a little problem there. I was able to enlarge the holes in these grommets, but this one back here is not as thick as the rest of them, and that's not going to work too well, so I just might have to put one of the thin ones on top of the one back here to try to even the height up a bit. And yes, I've looked in here thoroughly, and there's not a 4th one. In fact, what's left in this kit is the stuff that I haven't used over the years. All the stuff that I really need is not in here anymore. And then on top of that, the screws are now stripped, so I'm going to have a hard time putting this thing back in here. It didn't want to cooperate very well coming out. Must be one of those deals where this is a one-time only shot. Well, I'm sitting here trying to get this screw in, and I ended up breaking the band switch, which I don't really care at this point. I bypass it for standard broadcast only, because like I said, there's really nothing on that public service band anyway. And I'm about to the point of just wishing I'd have left the paper wadded up under it and been done with it. Well, I knew I should have taken that switch out, but I didn't, and here's the consequences, and now it's not playing worth a darn. Alright, after much looking, I found a schematic that I believe is for this radio. It's a chassis 6M and dated June 1939. This schematic is not that great, but it's better than nothing, and maybe I can use it enough to figure out this band switch assembly and permanently set it for standard broadcast, because I just don't think I'm going to be able to repair the old switch, and probably I'm not going to be able to find another one. Alright, here's a do as I say, not do as I do moment. Fuse blew in my power supply here, and the one in there was too small that what I had on hand from when it blew before when I did something stupid. Well, I'm ashamed to say, kind of running out of fuses over here. I don't have any 7-amp fuses, so there's the fuse, a piece of aluminum foil. I'll just be careful, and if anything shorts, it'll pop these fuses on the front, and I can wrap them with aluminum foil too. You know, while we're fixing a radio the offensive way, we might as well just go all out on offending people. You know, we're going to have the cap crowd jumping all over me for not jumping in and recapping the radio first thing. And then we're going to have the safety crowd jump all over me for putting foil across a fuse. And then we're going to have the politically correct crowd jump all over me whenever I show you the cabinet for this radio, when it's all said and done. Alright, now we're back in business. Good. And yeah, I really don't like that design. I think that main fuse should be a circuit breaker, and it should be on the back of the unit where if you accidentally trip it, you can just reach around and reset it, because a lot of these bench setups are just like mine. You got equipment stacked on top of each other, and in this case, when a fuse blows for whatever reason, then you got to pull everything out and disconnect everything and just tear the unit apart. Whereas if it had a circuit breaker on the back of the unit, I could just reach back around here, click, and it'd be reset. So instead of putting a fuse back in this thing, I might just very well put a circuit breaker on the back of the unit to give me easy access if that happens again. But seriously, don't do what I did regarding fuses, especially if you're not a technician that doesn't know what he or she is doing, because I've had too much equipment come my way for repair, especially television sets, where the TV would stop working. The owner, not knowing a darn thing about electronics, would pull the back off to look for loose wires, and, oh, here's a fuse, it's blown. And then they'd wrap a piece of foil around it, put the fuse back in the set, plug it in, and usually end up burning up a whole bunch of other things that were not burned up before, and then bring it to me for repair. And then when I tell them that someone jumped the fuse, they play stupid and, oh, well, I don't know how that happened. I bought that TV brand new and nobody's ever had the back off of it. And I'm like, well, whatever, but now the TV's not worth fixing, whereas before it would have been worth fixing had somebody left it alone. And one last word about the fuse. What I just did is something that I don't think I've ever done in 30 plus years of doing this. But this is one of those situations where I don't have the correct fuses here. I need this piece of equipment to be operational until I get the correct fuses here. And you do what you got to do. And in this case, I knew why the fuse blew, because the one I had in there was underrated in the first place, and I'm really surprised it didn't pop before now.
25% off your first.
Okay, that particular section of the switch that broke jumps in a tap on the antenna for standard broadcast. And I'll have to look at this closely, but it looks like when you set it to the public service or marine band or police band or whatever that band that's really not used anymore was called, it looks like whenever you jump that band into position, then it connects the RF amplifier stage into play. Like I said, I'm going to have to look at this closer, but I don't think the RF amplifier stage is used during standard broadcast operation.
To get started,
but with this antenna jumped, I'm getting better results than I ever had.
First order. 100% of the profits going to serve and support military families, like through the Semper Fi Fund.
So I'm wondering if possibly, and yeah, I can at least think this anyway, it'll make me feel better, if maybe that switch wafer was cracked in the first place and wasn't making good connection. And then whenever I accidentally hit it with a screwdriver, whenever I was removing the tuning condenser assembly, I just broke it the rest of the way.
Hey, Mike, that was fantastic with that latest charity. I love.
Now, something else I noticed on this schematic, which I believe to be correct in every detail to my radio chassis, is they have a cathode bypass electrolytic on the audio output tube, which was not connected when I got the radio. However, there's a low voltage cathode bypass section on this capacitor that they had the lead just taped out of the way. Well, not knowing that there was supposed to be a cathode bypass cap, I shortened this lead up. So now I think I'll strip this lead back, and if this section is good, we'll just add a piece of wire to it and connect it back up. And yes, I am getting a tad bit more volume and a little more bass with the capacitor in place. So yeah, we'll just go ahead and put that back. You won't be able to tell it on the camera between the camera processing and the YouTube audio processing, but it's definitely a bit of an improvement. So
Around.
a wonderful
Okay,
in the open.
okay. I patched up the speaker, but it's eventually going to need to be reconed or replaced. But fortunately, it won't be no big deal because it's just a standard 5-inch. Well, it won't be a big deal as far as mounting it because it's just a standard mount 5-inch speaker that's mounted to the front of the chassis. No goofy speaker mounting bracket. The only thing I'll have to do if I choose not to have this one reconed is replace the field coil with an appropriate resistor. But it does pretty good at low volume. It's just when you...
broken bone. And we say, that's so wonderful, God.
Just when you turn it up that it rattles. And speaking of turning it up, you know, I told you this had a 12 SR7 tube in it for the first audio and detector. Well, the schematic calls for a 12 SQ7, and since the SR7 showed a short, I put the 12 SQ7 back in there, and when we turn it...
When I was at USM, I was on the Student Religious Federation Council, and I was on the university.
And when we get too high in volume, it just distorts and drops out, so we need to look into that. Is the grid resistor the wrong value? Is the coupling cap off the volume control leaky? I know we substituted it before with the shorted tube and didn't really get any change in results, so we'll try it again with the known good tube and see what happens. Alright, the grid of the 12SQ7 is pin 2 according to the tube manual. And this schematic leaves a lot to be desired here. Alright, here's the 5 megohm grid resistor reading 9.3. So yeah, it's up pretty high. Could probably stand to be replaced. And it's really not that critical, you know, something between 3.3 and 6.8 ought to do fine. Alright, before we change the resistor, I have a capacitor substituted for the old one.
They want to help you.
And when I turn it up all the way, it doesn't drop out completely. It's distorted, but it doesn't drop out completely. So let's put the old cap back in circuit and see what it does.
Kids 3 to 12.
Okay, we have the old cap back in circuit. And when I turn it wide open,
you need to teach your kids
it goes into severe distortion and almost drops out. So that cap needs to go. Okay, we found a good old American-made 0.01 microfarad brown drop to put in here. And I found a 3.9 megohm American-made resistor that actually reads about 4.3 meg, so like I said, it's not that critical. The radio should still work just fine with it in place. Now the purpose of this capacitor, number one, is to help isolate the resistance of this volume control from the control grid of the tube, and it's also supposed to block any DC, even the smallest amount that might happen to be coming off of this volume control from making its way to the control grid. Well, since that other capacitor was leaky, acting more like a resistor, it was placing the resistance of this volume control in the mix and possibly letting a little DC come through. There's not going to be much DC there in the first place, but there could be a little bit, and that would be enough to upset the bias on the 12SQ7 and cause it to distort and drop out like what we just saw. Alright, let's turn it on now and see if it behaves better. Alright, much better.
€1,000 in cash, and I could buy an apartment for that. That would be an okay apartment.
That was wide open, and I'm getting some distortion, but that's what I expect to get. These things generally don't have clean output all the way to the top, but it's not dropping out and it's not as distorted as it was, so that problem's taken care of.
And it's quite big considering the... Should I be like... Speaking of wisdom, so I want to hear what you...
Alright, next I'm going to change out this .001 antenna isolation cap. Now, if you were only going to use the loop antenna, it wouldn't matter. And changing it out is not going to likely improve performance any, but it might make it a little safer if someone has an outside antenna connected to this. And you can see it there on the schematic. One end connects to the antenna, the low side of the primary winding on the antenna, and the other end of the cap connects to chassis, which in this case is a hot chassis. So that cap really needs to be there, because if you have an external antenna to this, and if the radio is plugged in so that the chassis is hot, and that antenna somehow gets grounded, it could vaporize this antenna coil here, or you could risk getting a nasty shock that might be lethal. So let's just go ahead and change that cap just to be on the safe side. But we will put a nice old American-made one in there. Okay, we have that capacitor replaced and a little bit of pigtail added to facilitate connecting an external antenna. I also jumped out the 2 wires from the loop antenna to facilitate AM broadcast reception, the ones we had jumpered under the chassis. I'll still need to go under the chassis and jumper out all the remaining connections on the switch, so in case the switch accidentally gets turned, you won't lose standard broadcast. The only reason that switch will even be there is to provide a shaft to put that knob on, so there won't be a blank hole on the front of the set. Okay, before we go any further with the repair, I might as well go ahead and show you the cabinet. And I can already hear the YouTube spy plane flying over. It tends to spy on people like me and Shango 066 who collect and repair vintage electronics. They don't like us doing that. They want us to constantly be at China Mart buying new Chinese garbage every 3 or 4 months. But anyway, I'm not much for painted radio cabinets, but whoever did this one did a pretty good job, and it looks like it was done a while ago. It's not a recent paint job. So when I saw it at the flea market and did a little negotiating on the price, it came home with me. You can see we have our patriotic red, white, and blue colors here on the cabinet, and this lovely artwork on the side of the cabinet here. And that does not look like a sticker. That looks like something that someone painted on there, and they did a good job of it. And we even have USA painted on here. And so yeah, whoever did this did a nice job. This is not just a typical take it out in the backyard and spray it down with a rattle can and in 5 minutes it's done. Somebody went to some time and effort on this. Now, if what I just showed you is not enough to make all of the left-wing, America-hating types wet their pants, the stickers on the extreme right-hand side of the cabinet will make them wet their pants. As you can see here, we have an Ole Miss sticker affixed to the front of the cabinet, and not 1 but 2 Confederate flag stickers affixed to the front of the cabinet. So yeah, that should make all of the protesters and flag haters and yada yada yada, that should make them all wet their pants at the sight of this. I really enjoyed my years on YouTube, because after this may be the last video you see of mine. Now, after seeing this cabinet, now you can kind of understand, hopefully, why I was trying to repair the chassis with as many USA-made parts as possible and leave as many parts in there as I possibly could. So let's see, what have we done that was offensive in this video? We didn't just immediately jump in and do a bulk recap of the radio chassis. We only replaced what caps that were needed to get the radio working satisfactorily. And for those, we used as much as possible 50 or 60-year-old American-made capacitors. Let's see, what else did we do? We left a 60-year-old electrolytic filter capacitor in place because it still checks good. When we removed the tuning assembly and encountered the stripped-out screws, we didn't take the tuning assembly to a machine shop and have everything re-drilled and re-tapped and all that good stuff. We just stuck it back in there as best we could. Oh yes, and we didn't replace the power cord with a polarized power cord and we didn't rewire the power switch to be in the hot side of the line. I'm sure that will be offensive to some vintage electronics cap changers. And oh yes, and we replaced the blown fuse in our variable isolated AC power supply with a piece of aluminum foil until we can get some fuses in stock. That'll really blow some minds. And then if all that wasn't enough, then I sprung this on you. And if you think all this stuff about flags and statues has gone overboard, I'll tell you one that's even worse. I was reading an article the other day from a Methodist minister who happens to be on my Facebook friends list, where some joker is wanting to have removed the United Methodist symbol, which consists of a cross and flame, because that symbolizes racism in his mind. Well, I'm going to tell you, I was raised a Methodist, and there's nothing racist about that symbol. And in fact, all of this so-called offensiveness and people getting their panties in a knot over symbols and things that happened 100, 200, 300 plus years ago, a lot of it really has nothing to do with being offended. It has to do with you have people out there who hate America and who hate anything having to do with Christianity, and they'll do anything possible to tear it down. And that's what it all boils down to. Now, they're not going to do it just in one whack. It's not going to be one big bang. It's these gradual chain of events that have been taking place over the years and that will continue to take place. So we're all going to have to be on our toes and stand our ground on this. It's just a shame that a select few members of society that make up the minority are allowed to dictate how things are going to be, and everybody's just caving into them. Like here in the state of Mississippi, for all my life, I've been hearing about teachers need better pay, and I go along with that, and we need better roads. I go along with that too. Well, here's how to get it done in a hurry. You just get the SEC to jump in and threaten to not play any championship games in the state of Mississippi, and that'll take care of the teacher pay raise issue and the bad roads issue real quick. Personally, I've never known of the SEC to play a championship game in Mississippi, but there again, I don't keep up with sports, but I mean, heck, it worked on getting the flag taken down real fast. Maybe it'll work just as well on getting the roads fixed and getting some teachers some more money. Alright, I'll get off of my political rant now, and we'll get back to the repair of this radio. Well, the AM band on here goes from, or should I say standard broadcast AM band, it's all AM, goes from 550 to 1630 kilocycles according to the service information. And our Marine band / police band goes from approximately 1.7 to 3.5. Now, the only thing we're going to really lose by not having that public service band is the expanded AM broadcast band, which, if we adjust our oscillator just right, we might can pull that out on the standard broadcast band anyway. But what I'm getting at, there's very little on this old public service band anymore. And it's not enough for me to complicate my life worrying about that band switch. So we're just going to delete it and be done with it. And one thing I might do down the road is add an auxiliary input to this chassis, which will require some special doing because this is a hot chassis set, and just put a switch on the front where the band switch was to alternate between standard broadcast AM and auxiliary input, which will allow you to plug your phone or cassette player or CD player or little record player attachment or whatever into this thing. And I think that would be more viable anyway than this almost non-existent public service band.
Thoroughly vested.
Alright, our switch has jumped out, so no matter what position it's in, you receive AM broadcast, standard broadcast.
A real estate decision.
Well, we got WSM coming in pretty good with the outdoor antenna. Okay, we have the equipment warmed up. The generator set to 455 kilocycles, and we're ready to go. Radio is plugged into an isolation transformer. VTVM is set to measure AC volts and connected across the speaker voice coil. The generator is set to 455 kilocycles and connected to pin 8 of the 12SA7 via a capacitor to help make sure the generator doesn't load down the circuit in the radio. And we will turn the volume up and adjust each IF trimmer for a maximum output. Now we will adjust this for maximum deflection on the meter. There we go. Do the same for the next trimmer. Looks like that one was already peaked out. There we go. IF transformers are peaked out now. Alright, next we need to adjust our oscillator, which determines proper dial tracking. I have the generator and the radio set to 1630, which is what the diagram says set them to. And for this test, we need to loosely couple the signal generator into the antenna of the radio. So we have the signal generator connected to the chassis, and we have our signal generator coupled to the external antenna terminal here. Now let's crank the generator up. Doesn't seem to be too terribly far off, but where's our screwdriver? Oh yeah. Well, it was a little off, wasn't it? Now we need to set the generator to 1400, which is going to be, we'll have to do it on another frequency because 1390 will interfere with that. Alright, I got it set to 1425 and we're still getting some interference, but let's do this. Whoop. About right there is it. So this radio should now be aligned. Alright, with the outdoor antenna, there's our little weak country station coming in, barely at top volume.
Perspective.
Something else weak coming in.
That new AI is up and running, man. You know, if you're familiar with the
talk station about 90 miles away.
A security tank on the
Okay, this thing is performing in the daytime about as good as I would expect. Alright, I went back in and re-Americanized this set. What few parts I actually replaced, I went back in and replaced them with American-made parts, resistors and capacitors. Now, out of what I replaced, the only capacitor that really had any detrimental effect on the operation was this volume control coupling capacitor. And the one going from the plate bypass of the output tube, I just replaced it because it's a high failure, short prone part, and it was pretty bad looking. Same story with the one across the AC line. The plate to grid coupling capacitor for the output tube had already been replaced, as was the electrolytic capacitor, which I left alone. AVC filter, no change in performance with a new cap versus an old one. Same goes with this tone capacitor here and this cathode bypass for the RF amplifier tube. And I replaced the isolation cap on the antenna just for safety reasons. But really what this radio needed to play right was a shorted tube replaced, a weak IF amplifier tube replaced. I believe this switch was jacked up in the first place, and whenever I accidentally touched it, it just broke the rest of the way, and me bypassing that helped things a great deal. And as a side note, a friend brought by this control board out of his garage door opener that stopped working, and right off the bat I see this 330 microfarad 25 volt filter cap. It's puffed up at the top, so maybe we'll get lucky and that'll be all that's wrong with it. There's only so much I can check on this with it outside of the rest of the garage door opener system, but I'll do what I can for him. And that original cap was wide open. There's a 330 microfarad 35 volt. My 330 microfarad stash consists of 25 volts, and we never go lower on the voltage, so I just went up to a 470 microfarad at 63 volt, and that should work fine. That's just a filter capacitor, so going up I don't believe would cause any detrimental effects on this. I've gone through and checked all of the diodes, and none of them checked shorted. And I'm going to ESR test all these other little caps on here, and if any of them are questionable, I'll go ahead and get rid of them, but he might have gotten lucky on this. Okay, ESR checks okay for the rest of the capacitors, and I can't find any shorted diodes or any other shorts on the power supply line, so I just went ahead and I resoldered all of the relay connections, the power transformer, this plug here, these 3 screw connections, and I checked continuity of all of the relay coils, and all that seems to be good. So at this point, all I know to tell him to do is put it back in and see if his garage door works. Now that filter capacitor opening up could definitely stop the whole works from operating, so like I said, he may just get lucky on this one. And this old capacitor is a Leland brand. Yeah, that's about par for the course. Put the cheapest crap Chinese parts that you can get in this stuff. Well, there's WSM coming in tonight. Had a little scare with the 18-year-old Ream central air conditioner this afternoon. Lights flickered a couple of times, got real dim, then came back up like there was either a severe short circuit on the line or a brownout. So I'm like, well, what happened? So the first thing I did was to go check the air conditioner, and the condenser fan was blowing hot air, and the compressor wasn't purring like a kitten, so I pulled the cover off and checked, and we were getting 220, 240 volts there at the contactor. Checked the contactor, all that was good. First checked the continuity of the windings on the compressor, and everything was open circuit, so I let things cool down a while and rechecked them again, and then the windings checked what I thought was kind of on the low side, maybe a couple of ohms, maybe a little less. And I said, well, we got a shorted compressor. And I checked from the windings to the case of the compressor, and no shorts there, so that was a good sign. So I just turned everything off and condemned the compressor. In fact, we were even went to town to buy a couple of window units, and a couple of places we went to were out of them, so we came back home, and I've done a little looking around on the internet and YouTube, and come to find out those compressor winding readings are usually low like that. So I said, well, maybe that brownout lights flickering event earlier was something to do with the power company, and the compressor went down and came back up too quickly and tripped the internal overload. So put everything back together and turned it on, and so far it's purring like a kitten. And that's a good thing, because I know an 18-year-old system, its days are probably numbered anyway, and I'm going to have to replace it sooner rather than later, but I'd like to not have to replace it right now if I don't have to, because they don't exactly give those things away, and if I can put it off a little while longer, then that's what I'd rather do. And I also know the system that replaces this one is likely not going to last near about 18 years. You know, that's pretty much what sucks about appliances today. You pay a big price for them, but you don't get a lot of years out of them like you used to. Even with air conditioners, sometimes those things would go 25, 30 years and still be going. I know when my dad finally broke down and got central heat and air in the house in 1996, because the 33-year-old American Standard gas furnace was on its last leg. And it really shocked me, because he said he'd never have central air, because when it goes out you lose everything. At least when you have 3 window shakers in your house and one of them goes out, then you've still got 2 more to fall back on. And I agree with him 100% on that. In fact, if this one goes out, I'd be tempted just to buy 2 or 3 window shakers and just go with that. But at that time, we had 3 window shakers in the house, and one of them I know was about 33 years old and was still kicking, an old Whirlpool-built Sears cold spot. In fact, Dad gave all the window units to the guy who put our central unit in, and he was very happy to get that 30-something-year-old Sears cold spot. In fact, I wished I still had it today. I'd keep it put down here in the shop when this modern Frigidaire thing bites the dust. The first air conditioner in my shop, which was put in 93 or 4, whenever the shop got put back here, was a Fetters, and I got about, 10 or 12, 13, 14 years out of it before it sprung a leak. The one after that was a Whirlpool, and it was a piece of crap. I think I got 2 years out of it before it crapped out, and now we're on the Frigidaire, which is nowhere near the Frigidaire that the old GM era stuff was, but I'll keep using it till it dies. But if I'm ever at an estate sale and see a really old window shaker that's in good shape, I might just grab it to have it on hand. But okay, enough going on about air conditioners and all that kind of good thing. My friend's supposed to pick up his garage door opener controller board in the morning, and I hope that fixes it. And now we'll get back to the radio. Well, I was getting ready to put the finishing touches on the radio, and I accidentally came in contact with the speaker cone and put another crack in it, so we're waiting on the glue to dry. You know, these old speakers, when they get to be 80 years old, the paper gets very brittle, and all you have to do is look at it funny, and it cracks. But ultimately, this speaker is either going to have to be reconed or replaced. Right now, I'm not concerned about it. I've got a 5-inch speaker and an Emerson radio that someone gave me the remains of. I think it was a restoration that went wrong, and they parted out the chassis and sent me the cabinet and what was left of the chassis. and it's got a nice speaker in it, but it has one of those proprietary mounting brackets on it, and of course I could cut that off and mount it in this radio, but as sure as I do that, an Emerson radio will come along that I need that speaker for, and you know, I just don't want to do that. So one of these days, if I decide to, I'll either have this speaker reconed or I'll dig up something around here to replace it with. Another boo-boo I made was the dial string came off the track while I was working on it. So I just simply removed it and laid it to the side and was going to reattach it later. Now I can't find it. I don't know what the devil happened to it, but it's not on my bench anymore, and I can't find it on the floor around my bench, so what the devil happened to it? It's one of those situations that, you know, I can find a piece of old phono motor mounting grommet that has turned to powder, an old tube that's gone to air that I should have thrown away, a half a dozen old condensers that I should have thrown away. I can find all that now, but something I actually need, I can't find it. But I'm kind of like Shango at this point. I can still tune the radio, and so what if it doesn't have a dial pointer on it? If I find something down the road and decide to fix it up, I will. But as soon as this glue dries completely, this one's going back in the cabinet, and we're done with it. Oh, and by the way, my friend just called, and he reinstalled the logic board in his garage door opener and said it's working like a charm, so that was an easy fix. I wished everything that came through here was that easy, but then again, if everything that came through here was that easy, it wouldn't be as much of a learning experience for me. Now, I still can't find the string and the pointer and the spring. It's all tied together. I don't know what happened to it. So the radio is going back together just like it is. And if I happen to run across the dial pointer and spring and string and all that good stuff, I'll put it in a little baggie and throw it in the back of the radio and deal with it when I want to deal with it.
Christopher Hale, former Obama faith advisor.
All right, here we are back together. Yeah, the overmodulated Southern Gospel station.
And quite frankly, Dak hasn't taken one, other than signing the 31-4 tender. Include the same. But most people don't.
Talk station about 90 miles away, coming in pretty good. The little country station's barely coming in.
Found what they care about. I can't wait to use my new language.
That's usually the way it works. The one I want to hear is the one you can't hardly get. The crap I don't want to hear comes booming in.
Congress is dead. Democrat Georgia Congressman John Lewis died yesterday after a 2-year battle with pancreatic cancer. Lewis was the last survivor of the Big Six civil rights activist
During the coronavirus.
best known for
I send our prayers to he and his family. Lewis's congressional colleague. Dade County, according to county records, is 27%. The goal for the county is not to exceed 10%. As for hospitalizations, ICUs are at 119% capacity. The goal for the county is not to exceed 70%.
While other school districts are making decisions about students returning to the classroom, California has issued its guidelines. More from correspondent Polo Sandoval.
fall school semester approaches.
Do not risk kids! Do not risk kids!
The debate is
raging about how and when schools should reopen. California's governor announcing a majority of school districts in his state will not reopen for in-person teaching this fall.
This is how we start in those monitoring counties. It is not how we intend to end. We hope in some cases some of these counties fall right off that monitoring list and we're back up and running in person.
The coronavirus death toll in the U.S. has topped 139,000. Civil rights activist and Georgia Congressman John Lewis has died at age 80. He is being remembered by the Reverend Jesse Jackson.
John was so determined. He's the valedictorian of my class. Ministers, marched, and suffered. John suffered his way into prominence. Took the beatings on the head, on the body. He was suffered on the bridge. Reverend Jimmy shooting him out by Jim Clark. He left a sister in his mouth. But they suffered and bled for this thing's possible to control. I remember him fighting, never giving up.
I'm Ann Kate.
Today on Hey Culligan, smoother skin for...
All right, next,